Yo quería decir
So I'm going to be standing because I really hate sitting. So first, thanks for coming and thanks for the organizers for this really amazing workshops. Even so, I don't understand everything because I only speak English, but it's been really, what I understood was really good. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a very old issue in philosophy, and it's one of the dimensions of the debate between, on the one hand, empiricists like David Hume, and on the other hand, rationalists like Descartes. Only one aspect of the debate between empiricists and rationalists. According to empiricists, basically concepts and percepts are of the same kind, right? So the nature of your concepts are the same as the nature of your percept. By contrast, according to rationalists like Descartes, in addition to our percept, we have another type of ideas, another type of mental representations, which is of a different kind compared to our percepts. Right? It's a very long issue. On its face, it's an empirical question, right? What's the format, what's the nature of our thoughts? Is that similar to the nature of our perceptual representations? And it should not come as a surprise that over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of interest in that question in psychology and in neuroscience. In fact, it's fair to say that most of neuroscience and most of psychology on this question is dominated by the empiricist picture. Most of them believe that percepts and concepts are of the same kind. So here what you have is just a few names. In psychology, Basalu, Glenberg, and Mendler have been extremely influential in defending the empiricist picture. In neuroscience and neuropsychology, you have people like Damasio and Martin. You have also people in AI, people in linguistics like Lakoff and Svan, and so on and so forth. So there is a large movement arguing that our thoughts are of the same kind as our percepts. Right? There is no real distinction between thinking and perceiving. Now, I won't be able to focus on all these people. I mean, they don't agree on every aspect of their theories. They have disagreements between them. But I will be focusing on two of the best empiricists, empiricists who have defended what I think is the clearest theory. On the one hand, psychologist Larry Basalu, and on the other hand, philosopher Jesse Prince. So I'm going to take them as standing for the group of empiricists which are basically dominating the field in this area of psychology and neuroscience. So here's a quotation from Larry Basalu in a TICS paper in 2003. I won't read it in detail. Basalu makes two claims. On the one hand, he says, look, the reason why people have believed in amodal concepts, right, concepts which are not of the same kind as percepts, is mostly for theoretical reasons. They seem to have theoretical advantages. But he says, well, we can actually develop novel theories, novel empiricist theories with the same virtues. So I think from a theoretical point of view, there is no reason to be an amodal theorist compared to an empiricist. But he says, now when you look at the data, at the evidence, you see there is a very clear asymmetry between, on the one hand, neo-empiricism or empiricism, and on the other hand, the amodal theory of concept. Here's what he says. Two things. First, he says, look, there's a huge amount of evidence for modality-specific representations. There's a huge amount of evidence in support of the empiricist picture of concepts. And he also says that there's in fact very little evidence for amodal concepts, right? So on his view, when you look at the data do support empiricism over amodal theories of concepts, right? Even so, from a theoretical point of view, they are sort of on a par, right? So what I want to do today is argue that Basalu is in fact really misguided in his assessment of the empirical literature, right? And I think things have changed tremendously over the last 10 years. So that assessment may well have been true in 2003. I think in 2015, that way of summarizing the evidence is actually deeply misguided. So what I will be arguing is that, in fact, there isn't that much good evidence in favor of modality-specific representations, in favor of the view that concepts and percepts are of the same kind. I will be arguing that the evidence is in fact quite weak. And furthermore, I'm going to argue that there is a growing and, in my mind, fairly compelling body of evidence that suggests that concepts are amodal. They are not of the same kind as percepts. Right? That's my task in this talk. And the conclusion will be that, in fact, the conceptual brain is an amodal system, right? So the brain, when it comes to concept, is really amodal. So basically, Descartes got it right. Hume got it wrong, right? It's going to be the conclusion of this talk. But before I do that, let me make it clear that I really admire the work done by Barsalou and Glenberg and other people, right? I think what they've shown us is something really important. They've shown us that often what we do is offload cognitive tasks which are really difficult, onto perceptual systems and motor systems. So what they've shown us is that often to deal with our environment, we use our perceptual systems and our motor systems to solve the problems we have to solve, right? So we offload our tasks onto perception and action, right? So that's really what they've shown. What they have not shown is that there are no amodal system, no amodal symbols, right? So we've learned something from their work, but it's still the case that the conceptual brain is amodal. So here's the structure of the talk. The first thing I want to do is to give you a bit more information about the contrast between empiricism and amodal theories of concepts. So I'll describe them in somewhat more detail. Then I'll give you very quickly two plausibility arguments for the claim that concepts are likely to be amodal. They're not compelling, they're not conclusive, but in my mind, they actually give us strong reason to take very seriously the view that concepts are amodal. Then I will also fairly briefly summarize my concerns with the kind of data that Barsalou and colleagues have provided in support of empiricism. And then in the last maybe 25 minutes of the talk, 20 minutes of the talk, I will summarize what I think are the best lines of evidence for the view that concepts are actually amodal. All right, so let's start with the contrast between neo-empiricism and the amodal brain. A good place to start is a quotation by Jesse Prince in 2010. Here is what Prince says: to think about a category, empiricists will say, is to simulate an encounter with that category in a sensory way. Because categories look different in different circumstances, simulating an encounter requires drawing on a wealth of knowledge. Prototypes, exemplars, and theories may all be relevant depending on the constraints of the simulation. These sources of information are all very different, but they share several things in common on an empiricist picture. They are all made of sensory representations, they are all acquired through experience, and they are all drawn on to create temporary simulation in working memory. Right? So, for my purpose, two things really matter in that quotation and in the work of Barsalou and Prince. First, it's a claim about the nature of our thoughts, of our representations, the format or code of our representations, and that's one here. And second, it's a claim about what thinking is, what processing is, what we do when we are engaged in thinking. So let's start with the first claim, the claim about the format or code of our thoughts. So the view is that the information that is stored in a concept, that is constitutive of a concept, is encoded in perceptual representational codes or formats. What does that really mean? Here's a very simplistic, a very naive picture of how perception works. Bear with me, it's an incredibly simplistic description, but the idea is there are some stimuli out there in the world that influences our perceptual organs, our eyes, for example, or ear, and there is a phenomenon of transduction, right? So we translate this, the effect of the stimuli on our organs onto visual representations and auditory representations. Now, these visual representations may be very complex. You may have many of them. They may be organized in a hierarchical manner. You don't have to have a single code. You may have many codes. But the format or code is specific to encoded information about visual properties. And the same is true of the representations which encode information about auditory properties. Now, according to Amodal theorists, according to Descartes, according to Fodor, and according to myself, what we do when we create a concept is a phenomenon of translation, right? So concept creation involves translating from one language, one code, into another language, another code, right? So the idea here is what we do when we create the concept of dog, for example, in long-term memory, in one or many stores, does not really matter, is translate that information into a new code, into a new language, right? So that's the picture that Fodor and Descartes, to a large extent, embrace. By contrast, if you're someone like Barsalou and Prince, you do not view the creation of a concept as a phenomenon of translation. You view it as a phenomenon of selection, right? So according to someone like Barsalou and Prince, what you do when you create the concept of dog out of your experiences of dogs is select a subset of your perceptual representation and store them in long-term memory, right? So according to empiricists, concept creation is a phenomenon of selection of perceptual representations. According to Amodal theorists, it's a phenomenon of translation, right? You have one code and you create symbols, representations in another code, in the same way where I could take a sentence in French and create a sentence in English, right? I move from one format to another format, right? So that's one aspect of the contrast between Amodal theorists on the one hand and empiricists on the other hand. So that was for thinking, for the format of our thoughts, or the codes of our thoughts. What about, that was for the format of our thoughts. What about thinking, the process of thinking, processing? Well, empiricists have this interesting and really quite challenging picture, really exciting picture, according to which thinking really involves reenacting perceiving, right? On their view, what you do when you are thinking about dogs is reenacting seeing, hearing, smelling a dog, simulating hearing, smelling, seeing a dog. So the thinking is really a matter of putting oneself in a situation as if one were perceiving the object of one's thoughts. So the view is that you retrieve the perceptual symbols that you have stored in your memory, right? And you use those in your visual system. You reenact these perceptual symbols in your visual or auditory or olfactory or motor systems. Right? So that's a picture about concept creation, which involves a selection of perceptual representations, and a picture about thinking, which involves reenacting perceiving. Right? Now, throughout this very quick introduction, I've been using the notion of a code or the notion of a format. Right? I've been saying, according to empiricists, concepts and percepts have the same code. According to Amodal theorists, concepts and percepts have different codes. But what I've not explained to you is what it means to say that two types of representations have the same format or have the same code, right? I've just given you some examples, French and English, for example. I've not given you a theory of that matter. Now, Barsalou and Prince are aware of the challenge of spelling out that notion of a code or a format of representation. But their answers are really unsatisfying. So here's what Barsalou says. Barsalou says, look, Amodal representations have to be linguistic. Perceptual representation have to be analog. Where an analog representation is roughly a representation whose properties vary in a continuous manner as a function of what gets to be represented. Think, for example, of a map, right? A map is an analog representation because the distances on a map vary as a function of the distances in the real world, right? A mercury thermometer is also an analog representation, right? In the same sense. Now, that's a bad way of distinguishing Amodal from perceptual representation, right? That's Barsalou's proposal, but I think we should reject it. Why should we reject it? Mostly because we don't want to identify Amodal symbols with linguistic symbols. We want to leave open the possibility that there are some Amodal symbols which just are not linguistics, which just don't involve the features of languages, a syntax, primitive words, a way of combining primitive words, a compositional semantics. Right? So we don't want to define the notion of an Amodal symbol by means of the notion of a linguistic symbol. So that's a bad way of characterizing the representational codes of Amodal symbol. Prince has another strategy in his concept book. He says, look, I'm not going to tell you what Amodal formats are. I'm just going to tell you there's a format used. I'm not going to tell you what perceptual formats are or perceptual codes. I'm just going to tell you there's a codes or formats used by the perceptual part of the brain. Now that's not going to be very helpful because he never tells us what he thinks the perceptual parts of the brain are, right? So V1 maybe, obviously, V2, V4, what about MT? What about STS? You know, how far do the perceptual parts of the brain go? And until we have specified this notion of a perceptual system, that way of characterizing perceptual codes or perceptual formats is just not going to be of any use, right? So what we have is to do better than either Basalu and Prince when we try to explain what the format of Amodal symbol and of perceptual symbol could be. Right? Now, it's a very difficult question, and in fact, there's no good answer in the literature. There's no answer I know that I find satisfying, and I'm happy to hear some suggestions, but I've thought really hard about it, and it's just really hard to know how that's going to work. But the good news is that we can actually bracket that question. Right? We don't need to specify what distinguishes a perceptual code from an Amodal code. Why can we bracket that question? Well, the reason is that what we really need is, instead of a definition of what a perceptual code versus an Amodal code, what we really need is a sequence of tests, a group of tests that are plausible and that tell us whether some tasks, some experimental tasks, involve perceptual representations or Amodal representations, right? So we can really bracket the definitional question provided we have experimental ways of telling whether or not a specific task involves Amodal representation or perceptual representations. None of these tasks are going to be bulletproof, right? But when they converge onto the same claim, right, that's going to give us very strong evidence that a given task recruits either perceptual or Amodal representation. Here are a bunch of tasks which I think meets this requirement. Transfer cost, what is that? Well, according to perceptual theorists, according to Basalu and Prince, when I'm thinking about the color or shape or motion of an object, I use my visual systems. I simulate seeing the object, right? So I'm engaged in visual simulation. That means that when I'm asked to do something else involving vision, it should be easier. I should be primed to, it should be easier for me to think about another color, another shape. By contrast, it should be harder for me to think about the sound of an object, because to do so, I would have to move from my visual system toward my auditory system, right? I have to make a transfer from one way of simulating an object to another way of simulating an object. So when you have transfer cost, it's plausible that you're dealing with a perceptual representation. When there is no transfer cost, on the other hand, it's plausible that you're dealing with an Amodal representation. What about facilitation and interference? Well, here the idea is, if you are someone like Basalu, you say that when I think about a dog, what I do is simulate seeing a dog. But let's imagine that at the same time, I'm actually seeing a cat, right? I have a perceptual experience of a cat. Then my perceptual experience is going to interfere with my capacity of thinking about a dog. By contrast, if I see a dog, I'm going to be facilitated in my capacity, in the task, right? So effect of facilitation and interference also are going to provide you with the feasible evidence about the format of representations. Another thing we can use is the localization of brain activation. People like Basalu and Prince are committed to the view that when I think about dogs, the visual systems, early visual systems, the auditory systems should be used to think about dogs. So we can look at the localization of brain activation, and so on and so forth. Right? So what we have here is tests which are plausible ways of telling whether or not a given task involves perceptual or Amodal representation. All right, so that was just a quick introduction to the debate. On the one hand, you have neo-empiricists. On the other hand, amodal theorists. Empiricists say thoughts, concepts, they're just like subset of perceptual representations. And thinking is just a matter of reenacting or simulating seeing, hearing, and so on and so forth. And I've given you some tests which can plausibly tell us whether or not we are using perceptual representations or amodal concepts. So what I want to do very quickly now is to give you two arguments for the claim that we should take the hypothesis of an amodal brain very seriously. Right? These arguments are not conclusive. It's perfectly fine to find them underwhelming. But I think they raise our prior probability. Right? They say, yeah, we should take the amodal view quite seriously. The first one is a design argument against neo-empiricism. And the view is, look, if neo-empiricists like Basalu or Prince or Glenberg or Martin were right about concepts, the brain would be so badly structured, right? Because it means you would use the same system for perceiving dogs and thinking about dogs, for perceiving cats and thinking about cats. What you would predict is a massive amount of interference between your perception and your cognition, your percepts and your concepts. It would be really weird to have a system which gives rise to so much possibility of interference. That would be, in a nutshell, a very bad design. And we can expect evolution to get rid of these very bad designs by creating some kind of separation between, on the one hand, perception, and on the other hand, cognition. Right? It's not an overwhelming argument, but I think it's a serious argument. When you think about it, the kind of architecture that Basalu and Prince are giving us is just a bad way of organizing our thoughts. That's a very bad design for thinking. The second argument is, I think, much more compelling. And in fact, I still think it's a decisive objection to empiricism. And of course, it's not a new argument. It's an argument that Descartes already made back in the Meditations. So Descartes noticed that when I'm given some of these figures, which are kilogons, I guess it says kilogons, that's the way to say it. They're kilogons because they've got 1,000 sides, right? If I give you a kilogon with 1,000 sides and a figure with 999 sides, you will not be able to perceivably distinguish them. And in imagination, we cannot distinguish kilogons from very similar pictures, right? So there's a fineness, but however, we have a concept of a kilogon, which is not a concept of a figure with 999 sides, right? So the view that Descartes gives us here is a very insightful argument, is that thoughts, conceptual thoughts, is more fine-grained than perception and imagination. Right? We can draw distinction in thoughts by means of concepts that we cannot draw by means of vision or by means of imagination. Right? So thinking is more fine-grained than perceiving. And again, that's a decisive objection. It suggests, in my mind, that's a fairly decisive objection. It suggests that, at least for abstract concepts, perceptual representation will not do, because they're never fine-grained enough. Concepts have a grain which is finer than perceptual representations. Now, in all fairness, neo-empiricists like Basalu and colleagues are fully aware of this challenge, right? They know that Descartes as well as I do. Maybe not, but they know that Descartes. And they've been trying for now 10, 15 years to give us explanations about abstract concepts within the empiricist framework. Now, I think that's a horrible piece of science overall. I think that's a very underwhelming result, and all for the same reason. It's because in all the research they give us, you never find the appropriate fineness of grain. Let me give you just an example coming from Basalu's BBS paper in 1999, but you have the same problem again and again. Here is the way, according to Basalu, we entertain the concept of truth. We have a first simulation, we have another simulation, and we match these two simulations to one another. Right? So on Basalu's view, grasping the concept of truth is simulating matching two perceptual representations. Now, the obvious problem is that the concept of matching just isn't fine-grained enough for the concept of truth. Matching corresponds to the concept of similarity, the concept of truth, the concept of distance, the concept of approximation, the concept of verisimilitude. All these concepts are represented by the same perceptual representation, right? So what we have here is an instance of Descartes' objection to empiricism. The visual representations of matching just isn't fine-grained enough for the concept of truth. And in fact, that problem emerges again and again when empiricists are trying to explain abstract concepts within their framework. Right? And I'll leave it at that. So there's two arguments here that suggest, yes, the amodal brain is really a very serious hypothesis. It seems to be the only one which is able of making sense of abstract concepts, and also it has these design virtues that the empiricist architecture does not have. So what I want to do now is moving away from these plausibility arguments, looking at the data. What the data show? And the first thing, remember, that Basalu said is, when you look at the recent science, there is a huge amount of evidence for empiricist theories of concepts. Now, what I want to do in the next 10 minutes, or 5-7 minutes, is challenge that claim. I've already done it in a paper published now 8 years ago in Cognition in 2007. Where I discussed at length what I saw was the shortcomings of the research done by Basalu and colleagues at the time. Now, since 2007, empiricists have published a huge amount of paper. People working in the embodied tradition have published a huge amount of paper. So many of my examples are really outdated. But the concerns I raised back in 2007 apply to most of the research done since then. Right. I can't say for sure to all research, but there's more than one article that falls prey to the objection I made back in 2007. I just want to focus on two of the issues I mentioned or explained in this 2007 paper. The first one is called Anderson's problem, and the second one is imagery problem. Anderson's problem is the fact that when you have someone like Basalu or one of his colleagues, you are trying to contrast, on the one hand, the empiricist prediction and the amodal prediction, right? You want to say, okay, if empiricism is right, that's what we're going to be getting. If amodal theories of concepts are right, we're going to get this other result. And now you need to specify what the amodal theories, what the amodal predictions are. You need, in a sense, to say, okay, well, if you're an amodal theorist, here's what you predict. Now, the problem is, in fact, that it's almost always the case that there are existing amodal models of concepts, right, that make exactly the same prediction as the predictions derived from the empiricist framework, right? So we're going to end up in an underdetermination issue here. The second problem is the imagery problem. I'll come back to that in a minute. So let's start with Anderson's problem. I will just give you a very quick example. I can go into detail in the Q&A if you're interested, but for the sake of time, I'll just gesture at the issue. It's a paper published in 2009 by Wu and Basalu. The research was done a decade before that by Ling Wu. She was a PhD student of Larry Basalu. And here the goal is to show that when you are asked to combine concepts to create new complex concepts out of simple concepts, you engage in perceptual simulation. Right, what Basalu would say, right? To create a new concept, you need to imagine combining the two entities, right? So if I ask you to combine the concept of a house and the concept of a face, to have a face house, the view is that to do that, you're going to create an image, a visual image of a house with a nose, eyes, and maybe ears, right? So you're going to engage in simulation, right? So they have to specify what the amodal prediction is, right? And to do so, what they use is, they use a model, a very influential model of concept combination published in 1988 by Edouard Smith and colleagues. Maybe the most influential model of concept combination, right? A great piece of cognitive psychology. And it's an amodal model of concept. And what they show in their paper is that that model of concept just makes the wrong prediction, right? In the task. And from that, they conclude, well, look, amodal theories are wrong, right? Because this amodal model of concept makes the wrong prediction in contrast to the empiricist theories of concept. Now, the issue here, the problem here, is that in fact, when you look a little bit at the literature on concept combination, you have a range of models of concepts, all of which assume that concepts are amodal, and many of these amodal concepts make exactly the right prediction in the task developed by Barsalou and Wu, right? So what we have here is one amodal model of concept is falsified by the data, but there are plenty other amodal model of concept which are perfectly compatible with the data, right? That's Anderson's problem, is that there's in fact a range of amodal theories which make very different predictions. And people like Barsalou have tended to pick one of these amodal theories and to take it as the exemplar of what amodal theories should be saying, right? So many of their findings are actually compatible with some amodal theory or other. So that's what I show in that paper, in 2007 paper. The second problem is the imagery problem. And to see the imagery problem, it's useful to read this old quote from our good friend Jerry Fodor in The Language of Thought. Fodor in that book says, of course, nothing I have said denies that images exist or that images play an important role in many cognitive processes. Indeed, such empirical evidence as is available tends to support both claims. So if you're someone like Fodor, someone like me, someone like Simon, of course you will agree that imagery is an important aspect of our cognitive life, right? So you're not going to deny that in some situations we're going to solve some tasks by means of images, right? So just finding that we solve some tasks by means of images cannot be by itself an objection to an amodal theorist, because every amodal theorist recognizes a cognitive role for imagination and for imagining. So what you really need, if you're someone like Barsalou, is to show that in a task where an amodal theorist does not expect images to be used, nonetheless, in that task, images are actually used, right? So you need to choose your task very carefully, right? Images should not be the best solution to solve the task. And in fact, what I argue in that paper is that many of the tasks that Barsalou has been using and colleagues are best solved by using images. So it's not very surprising that people use images to solve this task. And that can't be an objection to neo-empiricism. That's for the behavioral evidence. There's also a fair amount of evidence coming from neuroimaging. Here is also a quote from the TICS paper. They say, and you find that quotes everywhere since then, they say that in a neuroimaging task, what has been found is that when people are asked to think, the parts of the brain involved in perceiving are activated, right? So the idea is that thinking, we use the parts of the brain involved in perceiving. So for example, when you think about red, the color red, the part of the brain involved in seeing the color red is activated. That's a story we get. Martin has a nice 1999 paper, and since then has been doing a huge amount of work on that issue. But that's actually a misdescription of the data. It's actually just an inaccurate way of summarizing the data. The facts are quite different. The fact is that usually the activation is near, sometimes but rarely, overlapping with the activations in perception, right? I know only of one paper, there may be more, but I know only of one paper where you have identical activation in retrieving a concept and perceiving the object of that concept. So in fact, the science tells something quite different. You don't find identity. You usually find differences between the activation involved in thinking and the activation involved in perceiving. So the upshot here is that I quite disagree with the claim made by Barsalou at the beginning, that when you look at 15 years of research, there is a very large body of evidence supporting basically Hume against Descartes. It does not seem true. I think the evidence strikes me as often underwhelming, underdetermined, and suffering from various problems. But what I want to do in the last 10 minutes before I'm done is to very quickly give you some, I think, compelling evidence that the brain is in fact an amodal system. And I'll first start with behavioral evidence, starting with a number sense. So we talked a bit about number a few minutes ago. So human beings are extremely good at estimating, and many other animals are extremely good at estimating the number of objects in a visual image, right? So I give you that image and I say, how many objects? 20, 17 maybe, right? And we're very good at that. And in fact, when you aggregate across a population, the mean answer tends to be the right answer, right? So if I give you maybe 10 objects, the mean will be around 10, maybe 11, maybe 9, but it will be around 10. What you also show here is known as Weber's law. As the number of objects increases, the variance of response increases, right? So the variance of response when you've got 2 objects is really small. The variance of responses when you've got 3 objects is larger, and so on and so forth. And the ratio of the mean by the standard deviation is a constant, right? So as the number of objects to be estimated increases, the variance increases, and the ratio of the mean by the standard deviation is a constant. That's what it shows right there, right? It's a very important property. It's a very important property of estimation. Now, what's really interesting is that you find the same Weber's law for visual objects and for sequences of sounds. If I do that, and I ask you to estimate how many sounds, you're going to be 5, yeah? You're going to be pretty good, and when I aggregate across a sample, it's going to be really close to the exact number. And you're going to have also Weber's law here characterizing the estimation of sequences of sounds. Now, the view is that, well, that suggests that there's a single system involved in estimation, right? And that system is not modality specific. It's applied equally to seeing objects and to hearing sounds. So we have an Amodal system involved in estimation. Furthermore, we have this phenomenon that there is no transfer cost. If I ask you to add your estimate of that number of objects to that number of objects, you're going to give me a specific number. Then I ask you, okay, do the same and estimate a sequence of sounds. So behavior is roughly the same in both tasks. So there is no transfer cost. Again, fitting very well with the view that our sense for number estimation is not perceptual. It's Amodal. Furthermore, if you look at babies, that's beautiful work by Isa, San, Spelke, and Streri. So they look at 2-day-old baby, and you have the task is the following one. You train people on some sounds, which includes either 8 sounds or 4 sounds, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 8 times, and then 2, 2, 2, 2, 4 times, and then you show them either 4 objects or 8 objects, or 4 objects and 20 objects, depending on your habituation. And what you show is that 48 hours after birth, babies are able to discriminate between 4 and 8, 4 and 12, and 6 and 18, right? Again, what we have here is across sensory modalities, right? It would be really surprising if we had 2 modality-specific systems for estimation that at birth happen to be perfectly coordinated. A better, simpler explanation is that there is a single system for estimating number, and that it's an Amodal system. Right? All right, that's it for the behavioral evidence. I want to move to the neuroimaging evidence, starting again with the number sense. So we really know a lot about how we estimate numbers. Both I gave you some behavioral evidence or developmental evidence, but there's also a lot of work involving neuroimaging. So there's a complex network of areas, but an important part of this network is the intraparietal sulcus, both right and left. So the intraparietal sulcus is an important part of the brain network involved in estimation of the number of objects. Now, an interesting study has shown that this network is involved in exactly the same way when you give visual stimuli and auditory stimuli. Right? So that part of the brain, the mechanism for estimating the number of objects, does not discriminate between visual and auditory objects. So here are the data, that's the estimation task. What you have here is the intraparietal sulcus, and the first bar here is the visual, the fourth bar here is the auditory stimuli, and there is no difference here between the two conditions. The same is true by and large of the whole network. So basically, visual stimuli and auditory stimuli, the brain works the same way. Again, I think that's really compelling evidence that our sense of number just is an amodal system, not a perceptual, not a modality specific. Now you may say, I can imagine Basel who say, oh, well, good, fine, I give you the number. Everything else is perceptual. That would not do, because in fact, we can move beyond number to the concept of action. There is now a large amount of work suggesting that our concept of actions are actually amodal themselves. So here is some work by Bedney and colleagues. There's a bunch of papers following up this early. That's the first paper they published. There's a bunch of other papers replicating and extending this finding. What they do is compare high motion verbs, high motion nouns, low motion verbs, low motion nouns. So nouns and verbs whose meaning is either associated or not associated with motion. And they look at the brain areas involved in motion perception. So you have empty, right and left. You have, which is not specialized, it's just basic motion. It's not specialized for different types of motion. You have the STS, which is specialized for biological motion. And what you show is that for empty, there is no distinction between these categories. So contrary to what an empiricist would predict, that the part of the brain involved in motion perception, right, would be reused when you're using high motion verbs and high motion nouns by contrast to low motion verbs and low motion nouns. That's just not what is found. That part of the brain does not distinguish concepts involving motion from concepts that do not involve motion. And when you look at the STS, you do find a distinction, but it's not between concepts involving motion and concepts that don't. It's between verbs and nouns. It's a syntactic distinction, not a semantic distinction. Right? Again, that suggests that it's not the case when we're thinking about actions that we're imagining seeing the action. Because if that's what we did, you would find a difference either in MT or in STS. And you don't find a difference in MT or in STS. Another way to go at the concept of action is to look at people who are born without vision, people who are blind, who are blind since birth, right? So if you're blind since birth, very likely you've never seen an action, right? That's what it means to be blind. In consequence, when you're thinking about the action, you can't simulate seeing the action because you've never seen the action in the first place, right? So if you're right, that should predict a difference between the blind people and the sighted individual, and the blind individual. So if Basel is right, we should see a difference. However, Bedney and colleagues have found that there is no difference at all between the sighted and the blind when you ask them to entertain concepts of artifacts. So okay, what we see now is number, concept of actions. What about other concepts, like concepts of beliefs and desire, psychological concepts? Well, what we know from a very large literature is that there is a complex network, and an important part of this complex network is the right temporoparietal junction, right? A very important component of the network for mind reading. Again, we can look at blind people, right? So if ascribing beliefs and desires to other people involves simulating maybe someone acting in a particular way, someone having a specific behavior, you would expect sighted and blind to have different activation in the right temporoparietal junction, right? And again, that's just not what you find. Indeed, if you look at the activation in sighted and the activation of people who have always been blind, and you ask them to read stories involving ascribing a belief or a mental state to someone else, what you find is exactly the same activation in sighted and in blind people. Suggesting again that to entertain the concept of a belief is not to simulate seeing anything. Right? It's probably something amodal. All right, so we've seen number sense, concepts of action, concepts of beliefs, desire, psychological concepts. What I want to finish is artifact concepts, a concept of a tool, for example. And we'll move to neuropsychology. Right, the study of deficits. There's tons of papers now, and I'd like to put a plug for the work of Mahon, or Mahon, I don't know exactly how he says his last name, on this topic, who's been doing a lot of beautiful work on the matter. But I will just cite a very early paper, and this paper is really nice because it gives you a double dissociation between manipulating an object and thinking about this object. Why does it matter? Well, if you're someone like Barsalou or an embodied theorist, what you like to say is, oh, look, when I think about a hammer, I'm simulating using that hammer. I'm using my motor representation of hammering, right? If that's true, if you can't use hammer anymore, right? If you are impaired in using hammers or keys, you should also be impaired in thinking about hammers or keys, about tools, right? And what you find here is a double dissociation. Some people are able to use tools, but they're unable to recognize tools. And on the other hand, some people are able to recognize tools and unable to use the tool, suggesting that thinking about a tool does not involve simulating using that tool. And the last bit of evidence, and then I'll be done, is some work coming from semantic dementia. So semantic dementia is a condition that involves the progressive destruction of the anterior pole. It's involved by a loss of our conceptual capacities. It's an extremely difficult condition. It's very painful. And empiricists make the following prediction. They predict that you should find a modality-specific conceptual loss. On their view, concepts, to have a concept is to think about the color, shape, the visual properties, then to think about the auditory properties, then to think about the smells, and the distinct representations. So on their view, what you would have with semantic dementia is first losing all your concepts involving vision, then losing all your concepts involving hearing, then using all your concepts involving smell. So using the aspect of your concept that involves smelling, the aspect of your concept that involves seeing, the aspect of your concept that involves hearing. By contrast, an Amodal theorist says, no, you're going to find a modality general conceptual loss. You're going to lose your concept of animals and then your concept of artifacts or whatever. But it's not going to go modality by modality. And when you look at the research on semantic dementia, the prediction that's the right one is actually the prediction made by Amodal theorists, right? You find a modality general conceptual loss and not a modality specific conceptual loss. So what we've seen here is 3 types of evidence using different tools: behavioral evidence, neuroimaging data, neuropsychological findings, looking at a range of concepts, representation of numbers, concepts of artifacts, concepts of psychological states, concepts of actions. And across these ways of getting evidence, across these kinds of concepts, we find again and again the same story. It looks like concepts are really amodal. Right? It looks like really, in a sense, our good old friend René Descartes was actually on the right track. The brain, we thought the mind, but I think the brain is really at the end of the day an amodal system. So if you're interested, here are 3 papers, the one in cognition, the one in Juarez Coxai, and the forthcoming one in a psychological bulletin and review. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Edouard, for your very interesting talk. I pretty much agree with you and with the card. So, but I had to prepare some comments and questions to you. So let's see if I did it well. The first one, it has to do with your theory of 2008 about the elimination of concept of concepts. So you say that concepts are not a natural kind. They don't exist as a kind, so psychology should get rid of them. Science and concept, you say, is like doing science of Tuesdays. If concepts are not a natural kind, and if psychology should eliminate the notion of concept, how is it possible to trust in empirical psychological research based on that misguided notion to solve any dispute? For example, the dispute about the moral or moral format of concepts. In other words, if concepts are not a natural kind, as you argue, how can the evidence for the moral brain, which seems to treat concepts as a natural kind, be trustworthy? What is the kind of thing concepts are in the moral brain theory and the offloading hypothesis? Well, you didn't talk about the offloading hypothesis, so well, but what about the moral brain? You say that the three usual ways psychologists use concepts are quite different and independent: exemplars, prototypes, and mini-theories. The notion of concept you use in your paper, the Amodal brain, refers to one or to all of them? Or which one is the reference of your notion of concept? To put it in a nutshell, if science of concepts will be like a science of Tuesdays, how can you trust in the science of concepts you use to support the Amodal brain thesis? So that's the first concern. The second one, theory of mind. The work of Sachs and collaborators shows that a specific region of the brain, the right tempoparietal junction, the RTPJ, is activated when you think about others' mental states. The evidence seems to show there is no perceptual or sensory modality involved. You use this to say that TOM is amoral. But you can give another explanation to that piece of evidence, given that the RTPJ is also activated in attentional shifts. So as Prince says, the activation of that region must be due to the shifts of attention between thinking about you, your mental states, and thinking about the other's mental states. Besides, RTPJ has been associated with the visual, auditory, and somatosensory systems. So you could also say that TOM involves, in some way, perceptual and sensory modalities. After all, many of the readings of other minds are on beliefs or propositions, but also many others are on feelings, emotions, sensations. So it looks natural to think that we simulate and evoke those feelings. We kind of feel the same way the other does. So it can be argued that given the empirical evidence that perceptual and sensomotor representations are used to read other minds. So I think you need to accept at least that the evidence is not conclusive, the empirical evidence, on the RTPJ and theory of mind. The third concern, this is kind of old-fashioned in spirit, behaviorist or neo-behaviorist mood. Why is it necessary to postulate the format of something when you can describe it in a functional way, with no structural constraints? If concepts are a functional thing, we can give a dispositional functional explanation of them, no matter how they are instantiated. To have a concept in the mind, whatever its form is to act in appropriate ways when it is involved. Why we need something else about concepts? More when the empirical evidence supports both moral and immoral views of concepts. At least for some important areas of philosophy and psychology, a dispositional approach will be enough to do successful research, predictions, and interventions. Well, you didn't talk about the offloading hypothesis, so I'm going to skip this comment. The last one, the argument of design. But that argument doesn't beg the question. You say that it is a better design to have two systems to perform two separate tasks, perceiving and thinking. But what neo-empiricists say is that perceiving and thinking are pretty much the same thing, so they can be performed by the same system. It would be bad design and too costly to have two different systems to perform the same task. So, well, this is my comments.
Thanks. So I'll take a few minutes to respond. So the first question is probably the trickiest to deal with because it put together two views I like to keep aside. You know, I'm a man who likes to divide things and not a very systematic thinker. So I wrote that book where in 2009, Doing Without Concepts, where I argue in a nutshell that what psychologists call concepts really are not a natural kind. It's actually a very disparate type of entities, and it's a mistake to try to have a single theory about that class of mental entities. And I also suggested, that was a further step, that we should probably get rid of the notion of concept. It was not very useful for the progress of psychology. And I think that's by and large still true. But now, of course, I have this other line of research where I argue that concepts, when I talk about concepts, are amodal and not perceptual. So now putting two and two together, that's not, it's problematic. So here's what I want to say. So I neglect the claim that we should get rid of the notion of concept. I still think it's probably true, but it's really quite tricky. I want really to say more something about the claim that concepts are not a natural kind and how that fits with the discussion of amodal concepts, right? Because I think that's actually probably the most interesting issue. So if you're an amodal theorist, you could make one of two claims. The first claim, you could say that all concepts are amodal, right? The second one, you could make that some concepts are amodal. So there is a kind of concept that's amodal. And that's sufficient to be an amodal theorist, because the only thing you really care about if you're an amodal theorist is a claim that, you know, look, some concepts are amodal. Their format is not the format of perception, right? Now, what is open to me and what actually may well be close to the truth is to embrace this second version, which is compatible with denying that concepts are a natural kind, right? So if I go the first route, then I reintroduce some properties that all concepts tend to have, and concepts again become a good class to do the science of the mind because we can draw generalizations about concepts. So I think what I should be willing to say is, in fact, look, some concepts just are amodal representations, just not all concepts. And indeed, that's only what someone like Descartes does require. Right? Descartes can say, look, some perceptual representations play the functional role of concepts, so they're bona fide concepts, but there are some representations that play that role and they're not perceptual. Right? So that's probably something that would be a way to bring the two together. Now, about the RTPG, so I'm quite underwhelmed with the Prince's story. So there's a lot of work, actually. There's two lines of work. There's some work looking, using MVPF, for example, in RTPG, suggesting that attention, the part of RTPG involved in attention and attention shift, and the part of RTPG involved in mind reading are distinct. It's not the same. They're somewhat, they're related to one another, they're close to one another, but they're not the same part of the brain. And also Sachs in 2006 has a nice paper suggesting that the part of the area near RTPG involved in thinking about oneself, right, which your story requires, is actually distinct from the part of the RTPG involved in mind reading. So it does suggest that there's something specific in RTPG about ascription of beliefs and desire, which is not simply either about attention shift or about moving from oneself to the other, right? Now the question is whether the data about blind people are fine-grained enough to be sure that it's really the part of the brain involved in mind reading and not that involved in attention shift or in self-thinking. And I don't know about that, right? So that would be the next step, is to really to look whether the data about blind people in ascription of beliefs are really fine-grained enough, right? That will answer the question fully. The third one is about why do we need more than just viewing concept in a functional, dispositional manner? Well, I mean, the question is, why do we need psychology, really? Well, because concepts, or the type of things that play the role concepts are supposed to be, are, in my view, meant to be mental things, they're psychological constructs. So if you're a psychologist or a cognitive neuroscientist, you're interested in their property. Yeah, I don't know what more I can say. That's just, well, that's why you do psychology or neuroscience, right? And the fourth one, the argument of design. Yeah, so I think your point are right. So as I said, it's not an incredibly compelling argument. So I do think it would be still really strange if the mind were built in a way that there is no separation between thoughts and perception. We know there's tons of So there's a very limited influence of our beliefs and desire, if any, on our perceptual states. There's some, but probably very, very limited. Because that does suggest there's some kind of distinction right there. On the other hand, you're right. That's something Barsalou also says. If you've got a single system, it's less costly, right? You don't need to have two systems, right? So the consideration of cost and what's best for design are a little bit tricky, really, to assess. What's the pluses, what's the minus, and how to balance them is actually really quite difficult. So I think the argument from design, I think, is more, it's not a compelling argument, it's just to highlight the fact that, well, if Barsalou is right, it's kind of a clunky architecture. But maybe there are other benefits that would explain why you would have this clunky architecture.
So we have some time for questions.
Thanks for this fascinating discussion. It's not a field that I know much about, especially not about the recent debate, and so I want to learn more about it. First simple question that I have is, if neo-empiricism is such a bad view, what on earth motivated it originally? Is it sort of traditional concerns with parsimony in your theoretical explanation of continuity, and this Humean background, like ideas are but copies of impressions and so on? Is that simply the whole background, or what did they want to achieve? The second question is, I had a lot of sympathy with the Fodorian statements that images might nonetheless play a role, so he concedes some room to the empiricists here, and seems to say that we should ascribe a different function to it. And that made me think one might add sort of another historical twist here, and this is just sort of comes out of my own idiosyncratic knowledge of the history. Of course, the standard response in the history of theories of concepts to the Humean view, which comes out after Descartes' view, is the Kantian view, according to which concepts are general representations, and percepts are individual representations of particular objects located in space and time, and you need to have both in order to be able to make judgments, in order to ascribe general properties to particular items encountered in experience. You can't do without one or the other, right? So that's a traditional argument for the necessity of, it's another argument in support of the amodal view, I think. And I wonder if the empiricists have simply ignored that tradition out of sort of a totally selective encounter with history.
Yeah.
And then finally, I was thinking also along this line of this Fodorian view, and also inspired by Kant, could one view the two positions not as incompatible, but rather as performing different functions in the following way? It's one thing to say what concepts are, and an amodal theory gives you the account of that, or a Kantian view perhaps also, which is amodal too, I think. And it's quite another thing to explain how concepts originate and how they hook on to concrete items of experience. And that would be the natural playground for the neo-empiricists.
Yeah, good. So I don't exactly know what the original motivation was, but clearly parsimony has always been part of the picture, right? And Barsalou has always been very explicit about that question, that it would be a much more parsimonious system if so representations we use for perceiving were also the representation we use for thinking. So that has always been one of the motivation. I don't exactly know from a because Barsalou started as a traditional amodal theories in the 1980s, and then had a switch between 1990 and 2000. And I never asked him why suddenly he developed that view. Yeah. So I don't exactly know why he decided somehow. What may be explaining. So he had done a lot of interesting work on the context sensitivity of concept retrieval. The fact that when I ask you to think about dog in one context, it's quite different from what happens when I ask you to think about dogs in another context. So he's got some interesting work around 1990 on that question. And he may have thought, and I'm pretty sure he believed, that the only way to explain the context sensitivity of concept retrieval is in terms of the empiricist pictures he did end up developing, which I think is a mistake because context sensitivity has always been a very important picture of some Amodal theories of concepts in the 1970s, for example. So I think that's a mistake there, but I think maybe he thought that was the best way to explain context sensitivity. It's possible, but that's really an interesting history of psychology, recent history of psychology question. So the second one is about Fodor and Kant. So it's really a difficult question. I don't have very much of a strong opinion on the question. So Chris Gauker, philosopher of language, has published a book on concepts 2 or 3 years ago, where he has a long discussion of Kant and Kant's views of concepts. But what he does, he interprets Basalu through the lens of Kant, while I interpret Basalu through the lens of Hume, right? So I don't exactly know what's the right way, because I think he views basically Basalu's writing about concepts as quite similar to construction rules of perceptual experiences, and he thinks that's basically what we get from Kant on concepts. I don't have very much of an opinion on the matter, but I think it's actually not easy to. Basalu isn't Hume. It's a bit more sophisticated or more interesting than Hume. In some respects, maybe it can be taking some ideas from Kant. So there's that. And your third question was about?
Do the two views not compatible in a certain way that they perform different tasks?
Yeah, so I agree. So, I mean, as I said at the beginning, and maybe I should have highlighted that a bit more, and it was the notion of the offloading hypothesis. So I do think what we've learned is that we often use perceptual representations and motor representations to solve the kind of tasks that traditional psychologists believed were solved by means of amodal representations. So we basically learned that we use a lot of perceptual and motor representations to go around in life. And I think we offload as much as we can, as often as we can, onto perceptual systems and motor systems. So there is even on my view, and I think on Fodor's view, and there is a role for perceptual representations and motor representations in higher cognition. I think what I'm reacting, and what people like Mahon and Karamada are reacting, is an overreach from empiricists, right? So showing that perceptual representation and motor representations are important in cognition, and from that concluding that all of cognition is perceptual and motor. So it's really fighting against the overreach.
Thank you for a nice talk. If I look at the title of your talk, the amodal brain, that is a truism in a certain way. Because the brain doesn't work in modes or modalities. The brain is a very complicated physiological organ that deals with all kinds of things: body temperature regulation, immune system, interactions, and among many of things, cognition is part of what it's doing. So the brain itself doesn't work in these pieces and bunches of things. Now, if we zoom in and we say, okay, let's talk about concepts now, then we're leaving aside most of what the brain does. And we just zoom in all of a sudden into these things. So in that context, then we could consider something like, well, maybe is the question of modality in itself a straw man question? Because we can say, okay, well, there is perception, there is vision, auditory, and so on, and those are the types of perceptions that are localizable anatomically. But how about proprioception, which is spread all over the body, and we can localize it in the same way as we do with vision and so on. And that seems to be very, very important in, for example, speech gesture co-production, which is what we do when we talk and we start moving and so on. And there's pretty good evidence right now saying that, well, I'm not arguing for a modal or a multimodal here, I'm just saying there's pretty good evidence now that motor action in semantic terms, so it's not instrumental action like me holding this mic, but it's me moving this hand as I speak in real time, that starts to be not really modal in the sense of doesn't fit any specific modality of being visual or auditory and so on, but it's motor action that is constrained by all the properties of real time constraints. So we have to take into account what happens when reasoning takes place. And there's a bunch of evidence showing that it's incredibly relevant. So my question here is, if you take Barcelou for concepts, it's maybe not the best choice for if you want to compare to the kind of example you gave with Descartes. So Barcelou's work is most about dogs, cats, chairs, and tables. And the concepts that you're talking about here are much more elaborated than that. So we should be looking at something equally, I don't want to say empiricist, but equally complex. And in that sense, if you look at the data of what happens when people are talking about future and past, tomorrow and yesterday, which are pretty abstract, and they start to gesture, pointing in certain directions, spatializing these notions. So then my question is that part of what the concept of future is, as being in front of us, or past being behind us, for example, and which is egocentric, it moves with you around the room when you walk, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't say, oh, we're done with the model answer, but I'd say, well, maybe if we look at other forms of body-mind sort of interaction in which you didn't mention today, maybe we would have a different view on this very question.
Yeah, so by modality, actually, I didn't mean to limit it to, I should have been more explicit about that at the beginning. I forgot to say that. I didn't mean to limit it indeed to vision, audition, and the discrete senses. You're right, actually. And Barcelou himself actually is very clear about that. So is Prince. So are embodied people, right? So the notion of modality here does include maybe proprioception, probably motor representations, and all that kind of things. So modality specific is actually somewhat of a misnomer there, so I agree with you that should be probably more explicit. Now you and I, on the other hand, probably disagree about assessment of the embodied literature. I don't think you're going to get the fact that somehow egocentric representation of in front or in the back has an impact on thinking about the past and the future tells me very, very little about thinking about the future. It just shows that, you know, there's some association between thinking about the future and maybe looking forward and looking backward. But I'm really quite skeptical that it's ever going to have the fineness of grain, that you will ever find an embodied theory of thinking about the past and thinking about the future that's fine enough to account for what it means to think about the past and to think about the future. So you do find indeed all these causal effects, but I think they don't show very much about the content of our concepts. But I'm pretty sure we disagree about this last, this claim.
So I would have been more interested in presenting that data than Barcelou's dogs and cats, because then you really get into, so I would be interested in why you disagree, because the Barcelou story, it's about cats.
It is. That's fair enough. That's fair enough. I agree with that. Yeah, that's fair enough. Yep.
Okay. In a way, I feel disappointed because I thought that, well, Max made reference to your former book, that you were trying to move forward to the classical debate between rationalism and empiricism. But since you want to take sides in that debate, I would like to know more about how this rationalistic option, according to you, can deal with the traditional questions. You've chosen a modality, or the question of the code, and you say that maybe not the rivals that you choose for your debate, but some empiricists are very happy with the idea of Amodal representation. It's empiricist psychologists that have studied the development of rhythm, for instance, or synchrony, as other examples, as in addition to the ones that you mentioned, or even spatial imagery seems to take place in a modal way. So I wouldn't say that empiricist view of concepts is incompatible with the possibility of a model. Maybe there are some neo-empiricist people that take this crazy view, but a modality seems to be basic for thinking. But that's just one axis of the debate. There is the origin of concepts. And if you've mentioned several times Fodor's work, so the obligatory question is whether you are also a nativist about concepts, about all concepts, as Fodor is. The next question concerns mental processing. I take it that this was the reason why these neuroempiricist views took hold, because the classical artificial intelligence-based views of mental processes as symbol crunching, as transformations of internal code, has been no progress in psychology, and the need to look for something, a different way to account for mental processes in terms of maybe reenacting or simulating or dynamical processes or whatever, is what empiricist views try to develop. So that's also the axis on mental processes. Do you take sides with the classical cognitivist view of mental processes? And the other question is, and you've mentioned just partially, but I think this is the strongest point for rationalism, which is abstraction. And I may add to your argument that just by combining the view of these sensory representations, you cannot get a propositional content, right? Thinking, especially higher level thinking, involves propositional contents that have truth values. Just by combining sensory, reenacting sensory, combining them, you don't get that. So this is a straightforward argument against that thinking takes place through imagery or sensory or reenacting. I think this is the strongest point, and also something like negation. So this side, clearly the rationalist has still...
Yeah, good. So, I mean, the first question was, it could be some. So some representations are amodal and others are not. That's fine with me. You know, I think, as I said, that one of the first things I said at the beginning, I think an amodal theory should be quite happy with that outcome. It fits very well with my view that concepts are not the natural kind, very different, very heterogeneous kind of representation. So I'm very happy with that outcome. But on the other hand, I don't think people who are denying that view are marginal, crazy people. I think they're actually fairly influential individuals who want to say all concepts, or nearly all concepts, are actually either embodied or perceptual. You know, that's Jesse's view, that's Prince's view, and there are tons of people who make that kind of claim. But I'm happy with the sum.
But that's not the empiricist view. Two people that...
No, that's more than two people. You know, literally, that's Martin's view. You have, I could give you a list of, that's Glenberg's view. In fact, some of the most vocal individuals in the field, that's their view, right? Heavily cited. Yeah, heavily cited, you know. But yeah, origin of concepts, I'm entirely neutral. So I was just focusing on one aspect of the rationalist versus empiricist controversy, aspect about the format of representation. It's completely orthogonal to the aspect about acquisition, right? So, everything I say, you can be an amodal theorist and believe that concepts are acquired. You can be a perceptual theorist and believe that concepts are innate, because you could have innate perceptual representations. The two questions are orthogonal to one another, and when you accept one view about the format, it does not commit you to say anything about acquisition. And since I don't have a view about acquisition, I'm not going to tell you my view about acquisition, because I don't exactly know how concepts are acquired. The third question was, yes, so I'm just going to deny the premise. I just think it's not even remotely true that we haven't made any progress in understanding how the mind could be a simple cruncher. I think all the recent work in Bayesian models of neural processing are actually, they're not the traditional version. There are transformation of vehicles, except instead of being sentences, they're probability distribution. But they're vehicles defined by their syntactic properties. They're just not words. And that's exactly the kind of models that's now booming in neuroscience. So saying we have made no progress strikes me as an overreach. In any case, I do believe it's also an orthogonal question. I do believe, even if you're an empiricist, you also need to have a story about how the mind manipulates representations. Whether they're perceptual or not, you need some kind of story there. And just saying, the perceptual representation is not going to give you an answer about how the brain just transforms these representations. So everybody here is actually in a bad situation because we. And the last question is about proposition. Yes, I agree with you. I've written a paper on that question. It's not clear how a hardcore empiricist would account for entertaining a proposition. What can be done is to have some kind of mixed architecture where some representations are amodal, like negation, for example, and some are modal. So you'd have syntactic amodal representation combined with open class perceptual representations. So that could be the type of structures that's possible. Yeah, but that's a traditional issue, and I think very hard to deal with if you're an empiricist. Yeah.
Apologies, please. Let's keep the remaining questions for the dinner, because all those ones going to attending to the concert, you have to run. So let's.
What concert is that?
Thank you very much, Edouard and Max, and see you tomorrow in the next classroom.
I didn't know there was a concert.